You know, when you think about emperors in history, you kind of just picture absolute power, right? Like that's the
Yeah.
image that comes to mind.
Right.
But as we're going to find out in this deep dive into Japan's 1889 constitution, things weren't always what they seemed. This document wasn't just some boring old set of rules. It was a huge turning point where Japan was like,
Oh, okay.
time to redefine ourselves for a modern world.
Totally. And, it all begins with what seems like a really simple statement. Article 3 just comes right out and says the emperor is sacred and inviolable, which, yeah,
Whoa.
it definitely makes you think he's all-powerful, right?
You'd think that's that. Case closed.
Right.
Someone reading this for the first time would totally assume that's the end of the story.
Sacred and inviolable. It's like not exactly open to suggestions.
But then a couple articles later, we hit articles 5, 6, and 7, and whoa, things get interesting. We're suddenly talking about this thing called the Imperial Diet, which is basically Japan's legislature, like Congress, right? With a House of Representatives and a House of Peers. And guess what? The emperor needs their okay to make laws.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild twist.
Talk about a plot twist.
You've got this seemingly all-powerful emperor, but then bam, he needs the legislature's approval.
Checks and balances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's super interesting how they balanced the emperor's traditional authority with this brand new system of representative government.
Okay, so not as simple as it first seemed, but hold on tight because Articles 8 and 9 come in with a curveball. They're all about emergency powers. The emperor could issue these things called imperial ordinances, basically like executive orders in the U.S. during a crisis. But, and this is important, even then, he couldn't just go rogue and rewrite all the laws.
Exactly. Even in a state of emergency, the Constitution still held sway over the emperor.
Wow.
And that's huge, EE.
Yeah.
That limitation on his power, even in extreme situations,
Yeah.
really shows you what the framers were going for. They wanted a government based on laws, not just the whims of one guy.
Right.
It's an idea that goes way back in political thought. And that whole idea of a government based on laws, it gets even more interesting when you look at how things actually worked in practice.
Yeah.
Let's talk about those big important powers you mentioned earlier, like taxes, the military treaties.
Right. Articles 11, 12, and 13, they give the emperor some pretty heavy responsibilities, being commander-in-chief of the military, deciding on war and peacemaking international agreements. It's a lot.
It really is.
You almost get the feeling like, okay, he's got all the important stuff covered.
Right. Sounds pretty powerful.
Exactly. But then, boom, Article 62 pops up and throws a wrench in the whole thing.
It does, doesn't it? Think about it. If you wanted to introduce a new tax in Japan back then, not exactly a small thing, you'd think the emperor could just say, make it happen, right?
Yeah, you'd assume so.
No. Article 62 says, hold your horses, emperor. Even you need the imperial diet to sign off on that.
Wow. So even when it came to something as basic as getting money, the emperor couldn't just do whatever he wanted.
Exactly. It shows you that his power wasn't absolute, even in something as fundamental as running the government.
That's a pretty big limitation when you think about it. Did the Diet ever actually push back against the emperor on money matters?
Oh, absolutely. There's this fascinating case in the early 1900s. They were talking about expanding the Navy, a big project, right?
Right. Huge expense.
Exactly. And of course, the emperor and his advisors were all for it, saying it was crucial for defending the nation. But the Diet, they were worried about the cost, how it would impact the Japanese people.
Makes sense.
So it turned into this big standoff. The emperor's vision versus the Diet's concerns really highlights that tension between different parts of the government. In the end, they compromised. The Diet agreed to a smaller version of the naval expansion.
So they really did have the power to say no to the emperor.
They did. It proves that these weren't just words on paper. The Constitution had teeth.
That's a great example. And it wasn't just taxes, right? Article 67 takes things even further in terms of money and who gets to say what.
Oh, yeah. Article 67 is where things get really interesting. Remember those emperor-specific powers we were talking about?
Yeah.
Like controlling the military?
Right.
Well, Article 67 says that even for things like military spending, even though it's under the emperor's authority, the Diet can still refuse to pay for it.
Wait, seriously?
Seriously. They could essentially tell the emperor, we hear you, but we don't think that's the best way to use the money right now.
That is wild. It really changes how you picture an emperor. It's like flipping the script.
Totally. And it shows how much thought they put into making sure no one part of the government had too much power.
So we've seen how the Constitution limited the emperor's power in making laws and even handling money. But what about the Japanese people themselves? What did this new system mean for them? And this is where Chapter 2 of the Constitution comes in. You might think a document like this would just be all about the emperor and the government, right?
I didn't think so.
But Chapter 2 is all about the Japanese people. It's like here are your rights, your duties as a citizen of Japan under the emperor.
It's pretty cool, actually.
Hmm.
And they didn't just, throw out some vague ideas about rights either.
Yeah.
Article 19 lays out a pretty important right.
Yeah.
It says that all Japanese subjects have a right to be considered for government jobs based on, their skills and experience, not just who their family is.
So qualifications matter more than connections.
Exactly. Which was kind of a big deal back then. The old way of doing things was all about social status.
Right, so this is like a meritocracy, at least on paper. It must have been a pretty big shift, opening up opportunities for people who might have been shut out before. But you mentioned rights A and D duties. What kind of obligations did the Constitution put on people?
Well, right there in Article 20, next to that whole equal opportunity thing, it's crystal clear. Every citizen has a duty to serve in the military if they're called up.
Interesting. So it's about balancing opportunity with responsibility to the nation.
Exactly. That idea of balance, it's woven throughout the entire Constitution.
It makes you think about the whole social contract thing. The people get certain rights and freedoms, but they've also got responsibilities to the state. Speaking of freedoms, Article 26 got my attention. Privacy of correspondence. No emperor reading your mail.
Although they didn't have to deal with spam folders back then.
Right.
It really makes you think about how those rights change and adapt with new technology.
For sure. And it wasn't just letters either. Article 28, that was a big one. Freedom of religion.
Yep. Though there's a catch. Always is. It says religious practices can't be prejudicial to peace and order, which you can imagine. In a society where the emperor was basically seen as a divine figure, that caveat carried a lot of weight.
Right. Again, it's about that balance. Individual freedom. Beiti, within the limits the state sets for the good of everyone. Okay, so we've covered a ton about this Constitution, how it put the brakes on the emperor's power, how the Diet had a say in governing, and even how it affected everyday people. But what about the Constitution itself? Could they ever change it, or was it set in stone?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer, like you might guess, is that they could change it. But it was not going to be easy.
Yeah.
Article 73, that's the amendment process. And they made it tough on purpose. Any changes needed the emperor to start the process, and then get approved by 2/3 of both houses of the Diet.
Wow, supermajority.
Yep. This wasn't a document you just casually messed with. They knew they were building the foundation for a new Japan. And those changes had to be seriously thought out and built to last.
Makes you appreciate the weight of it all, right? So there you have it, folks. The 1889 Constitution of Japan, a wild ride through tradition and change, full of twists and turns you wouldn't expect. Who knew a deep dive into something over 130 years old could be so interesting?